Sorry about that. We were doing a mic change. Thank you very much for having me. Thank you to the Expo team. I'm really, truly honored to be sharing this stage and this room with so many creative thinkers and doers. So thank you so much. This is my first time here, and it's my first time in Roanoke. So I wish I could stay longer. So I'm just going to jump right in. Next slide, please, which is basically the same information, my name. But I work for an organization called the Democracy Collaborative. We, in the parlance of Washington, D.C., where we are located, are a think and do tank. What that means basically is we do research and advisory work, technical assistance and consulting work to lift up best practices across the country of community economic development work. So if we go to the next slide, I'd like to start actually with a video of some of that work that's going on in Cleveland, Ohio. So I'm just going to step back and not fall into this hole, and we can watch that video.
Like many American cities, Cleveland was once a center for industry and good jobs. But the factories closed up or moved away and took the jobs with them. Today, over half the children in Cleveland live below the poverty line. Without jobs, poor neighborhoods get poorer, and disinvestment, lack of educational opportunity, and barriers to employment compound themselves. How can we bring jobs back to cities like Cleveland and keep them there? We need to work with what we've got, and a city like Cleveland has got a lot of world-class hospitals and universities. These are anchor institutions, large, non-profit institutions which are anchored to the city and very unlikely to move away. These anchors are the economic powerhouses of the city, spending billions of dollars every year on the goods and services they use every day. But a lot of that money is spent far outside the city. How can we use the billions of dollars anchors already spend to help lift neighboring communities out of poverty? The Cleveland model points toward a solution. Anchor institutions want to make their operations more sustainable, and this is an opportunity to create new local businesses to fill these new needs. But we need to make sure that these businesses stay rooted in the communities that need the jobs the most. In the Cleveland model, these businesses are worker cooperatives, owned by their own workers. Each worker owner has an equal share and a voice in the way the company is run. Democratic control of the company keeps jobs local. It's hard to imagine the workers at a company voting to eliminate their own jobs because it'd be cheaper to hire lower-paid employees somewhere else. And democratic ownership of the company keeps the profits local too. Rather than flowing out of the city to an owner in the suburbs or to some big corporation's offshore bank account, the wealth generated by the business is distributed broadly to the community members whose work makes that wealth possible. Keeping wealth local means that more people can buy more things in the community, which creates more jobs and builds more wealth. The anchor institutions buy things like clean power and local produce from the cooperatives. This was money they needed to spend anyway, but now they not only get the sustainable goods and services they need, they are also helping build jobs in their neighboring communities. And when the cooperatives have long-term contracts to supply major local institutions, they can be more certain that their businesses will thrive. They can even take these contracts to the bank if they need credit to help their business grow. It's a win-win situation. These cooperatives themselves cooperate. They are linked together by a larger nonprofit. The worker owners promise never to sell their company to make a quick buck, and in return, the nonprofit helps their cooperative business succeed, providing technical assistance and strategic guidance. The nonprofit also operates a revolving loan fund, which channels investment from anchor institutions, local foundations, and government programs to the cooperatives. As the cooperatives thrive, they pay back into the revolving fund, which eventually provides the money to help launch yet new cooperatives, creating even more jobs. If it can work in Cleveland, it can work in your city. With cooperatives in Cleveland operating the nation's largest urban greenhouse and installing its largest urban solar field, people are paying attention. The Cleveland model is spreading, with worker co-ops connected to their local anchor institutions springing up in cities across the country.
All right, thank you. I thought it would be faster and more entertaining to watch the video than to have me drone on about it. So what's happening in Cleveland is what we at the Democracy Collaborative call community wealth building. It's a term you've probably heard. It's actually described in the pamphlet for Expo here. And it is bubbling up in communities across the country as a new asset-based and inclusive approach to community-based economic development that roots jobs and wealth locally in communities through broad-based forms of ownership. The goal of community wealth building is really to create a new system of economic development and a new way of doing business in cities across the country. Next slide, please. So, why do we need to talk about a new system for economic development? I think we all have heard about the growing wealth gap in the country. Right now, the statistics of inequality in the United States are as dire as they were in the Gilded Age before the Great Depression. We have never seen so much aggregated wealth at the top and so much lack of wealth at the bottom in this country. The top 400 individuals in our country own almost 2 times more wealth than 185 million people combined. Those are the kinds of statistics we're looking at. And economic development and the way we create wealth and jobs in our communities has a big role in creating that inequality in our countries. So, in our communities, excuse me. So, community wealth building, instead of being based on attracting corporations and businesses to communities, corporations usually that are from outside the community and are not vested in or rooted in the community, as I know Roanoke's history knows very well, and many communities across the country, those industries and corporations generally don't have staying power and vested interest in the communities around them. Meanwhile, we spend lots of money eroding our tax base to attract and keep those businesses in our communities. Community wealth building, on the other hand, focuses on the existing assets that we have in our communities, building those up and connecting them more intentionally to both need in the community and capacity in the community. And it does so by rooting that activity locally through broader forms of ownership and through collaboration with existing institutions and organizations in the community. Next slide. And rather than outsourcing jobs and importing hiring to experts and people from outside of the community, community wealth building is oriented towards building up capacity locally and connecting it with existing demand in a way that more people can share in the benefits and economic impacts that institutions and activity is already creating in community. The goal, of course, is to create a new system, a connected and interconnected system where economic activity is linked to assets and community capacity intentionally and inclusively, especially for those communities that have been left behind from economic growth. Next slide, please. So we talk about these different elements of community wealth building, and why do we talk about that? We know that place is important. We've already heard from Ethan about how place can make such a difference in community and in lives. Where you live determines the education you receive, the jobs that you can access, the supports that you have from your family, from your community, from institutions. It determines your health. It determines your health outcomes. And in the end, it really determines your outcomes as a human and what you can do and how you can access this. This is just another example from Cleveland, a fairly stark example. In an 8-mile distance, there's a 24-year life expectancy gap. On my left, your right is a suburb of Cleveland, Lyndhurst, largely white and very affluent. The life expectancy there for an adult male is 88 years. 8 miles away in inner city Cleveland, a largely African-American community where unemployment rates are very high and a large number of people are returning citizens from the prison system. 64 years is the average life expectancy of an adult male. That's literally 24-year gap in 8 miles. So place matters, and our place-based solutions, our place-based problems require place-based solutions. Next slide, please. Ownership matters. We know that ownership of capital and ownership of assets determines wealth. Wealth is more than just income. A job alone will not help bridge the racial wealth gap and the other wealth gaps that we have in this country. Organization called CFED just released a report that even if our economy and our economic gains stays as it is today, it will still take the African American community in America 225 years to make up the wealth gains that white Americans have, just by virtue of being born into the access to assets and ownership that we have. So we know that ownership matters and wealth matters, and broadening access to ownership of both capital and assets creates stability for people that traditionally do not have stability and are usually one paycheck away from serious crisis. So ownership of assets and capital is extremely important. Next slide, please. Oh, there we go. And there are many different forms of broad-based ownership, some of which you're very familiar with. Cooperatives, we're right across the street from the food co-op here, but there are many different kinds of cooperatives. There are consumer cooperatives, producer cooperatives, worker-owned cooperatives, multi-stakeholder cooperatives that combine all of those different things. ESOPs, or employee stock ownership plans, are ways that companies can share stock ownership with their employees so that they gain a percentage of the profit. That's very popular in many companies across the country. But there are other forms of broad-based ownership that people are less familiar with. Community development financial institutions are community-owned banking institutions that invest in community and make capital resources available to community actors. Municipal enterprises are city-owned enterprises that make collective assets more easy and affordable for people to access in communities. It's a form of public ownership as well. Something that's not on this slide here that some people might be familiar with, community land trusts. It's a way of owning land collectively so that you can keep it affordable over long term. So there are many different forms of community-based and broad-based ownership that can be integrated into economic development plans. Next slide. And examples of this are all over, as I mentioned. Aesop New Belgium Brewery is one of the largest growing craft breweries in America, and it is employee-owned. It has a very low rate of turnover and high rates of employee satisfaction. A social enterprise in Seattle, Washington, Pioneer Human Services, is almost completely no longer needs any grant funding to operate its services that it provides to homeless and previously incarcerated individuals. So they have operated enough enterprises and produced enough revenue to support their own social service work and also to employ the people that they serve in their enterprises. And in the middle, Fifth Season Cooperative in Viroqua, Wisconsin, a rural part of Wisconsin, is a multi-staker cooperative that aggregates and creates value-added services for local farmers and producers in the region that then they can actually get to scale to provide all the food services to a local health system, so that health system sources every single piece of food that it provides to its patients locally from local farmers, thanks to Fifth Season Cooperative. Next slide. And we know that institutions matter. And when we talk about institutions and anchor institutions, we're talking about community-rooted public and nonprofit institutions. These are institutions that are not going to get up and leave and whose success is integral. Their success is integral to the success of the community. They're in this together. They need to understand their interconnectivity with the community. And they usually have a mission to serve the communities. On top of that, they are huge economic drivers in their community. They are some of the largest employers. I know that the health system here in Roanoke is the largest employer in the city. And they generate and they purchase tons of goods and services every year. Hospitals alone in our economy purchase over $300 billion of goods and services from every year. And often they don't do it from their communities. They do it through group purchasing organizations like Aramark and others like that, large multinational corporations that generally outsource a lot of that purchasing activity to other places. Next slide, please. So when we talk about an anchor mission, we're talking about institutions consciously applying that economic might to the communities, redirecting it and connecting it to the communities within which they reside, and particularly those communities in need that are sitting around them. The Cleveland example that we saw is an effort called the Greater University Circle Initiative. There are 3 or 4 large institutions in one small area called Greater University Circle, and they're very successful and very profitable businesses. As you know, Cleveland Clinic is one of them, one of the better health institutions in the country, Case Western Reserve University, others like that. Literally right adjacent to them are 6 neighborhoods where where about 54% of the residents live in poverty and aren't connected at all to those institutions and to their economic generation. So what started in Cleveland as an effort to connect those institutions better to the community has turned into a fully collaborative effort that involves city, foundation, community residents, community nonprofits, activism, and so forth. So that's what we mean when we talk about an anchor mission. Next slide, please. And when all of these things come together, you start to see a healthy community. When local institutions work together with one another, actually cooperating rather than competing with one another, and linking their purchasing power, their hiring activity, their investment activity to local enterprises, community-owned enterprises, local nonprofits, capacity building organizations and such, and the result should be jobs and wealth and expertise rooted in and growing in the community. So it's an interconnected ecosystem of support around this work. Next slide, please. And this work is happening all over the country. It has been going on sort of in isolated bubbles for a very long time. And what we're working on is really lifting up and connecting all of these efforts. And you're starting to see a lot of connected efforts come together. In Denver, one example, the city government is working directly with nonprofit organizations as well as the local community foundation to convene around community wealth building strategies and support it. They are supporting with direct investment, community cooperative development in their community, working directly to fund a local co-op that is largely immigrants and refugees in Denver, growing produce in their backyards, aggregating that into a community-owned cooperative that then will be selling its wares in that community, which is also a food desert and doesn't have access to nutrition. They are also developing a community land trust around a lot of the transit-oriented development nodes that they're doing in the city. As they develop that transit, of course, I think as we all know, there'll be a lot of economic activity and gentrification. Often the economic activity pushes out the people who were living there before, so they themselves cannot benefit from that economic activity. A community land trust keeps housing costs low over generations so that people can stay. It owns the land collectively, and then people can stay there over generations so that the people living there before can benefit from the increased economic activity without being pushed out by increasing housing costs. Next slide, please. And so that you don't think this is just an urban example, community wealth building can really apply and be practiced in all communities, including the most rural. We're doing some work in South Dakota on the Pine Ridge Reservation. It is where the Oglala Lakota Sioux tribe is. It is one of the poorest places in the United States. Unemployment rates are at about 80%, and it has the second lowest life expectancy in the Western Hemisphere. The life expectancy for an adult male, an adult Lakota male living on the Pine Ridge Reservation, is 46 years of age. That is only beat by Haiti, and that's here in the United States of America. So just think about that for a minute. But on Pine Ridge, there is an organization called Thunder Valley Community Development Corporation, and after years of, or generations, I should say, of sort of intentional disinvestment and disenfranchisement, a group of youth came together and spoke with some elders, and the elders said to them, when are we going to stop complaining? When are we going to stop talking about how bad conditions are on the reservation and start to take control of our own futures and create our own destiny? And so they created an organization called Thunder Valley Community Development Corporation and went through a very, very intensive, engaged community planning process where they reached out to all the residents and tribal members on the reservation, and they came up with a plan to develop what they call a regenerative community, and they're building a whole new community from the ground up. This will be an affordable housing community, but it will also have spiritual space, enterprise space, community space, and it will be done completely net zero using indigenous housing methods and so on and so forth. I am not an engineer, so I can't get into the details, but I encourage you to check it out because it's really inspiring. But they realized as they were developing this plan that this was going to create a lot of economic activity. They're going to be building a community from the ground up, and they didn't have the expertise on the reservation to do that, so what would they do? They would hire a construction firm and a contracting company from Rapid City, 200 miles away. Well, that doesn't really make any sense if you're generating all this economic activity to pay someone else to do it and have them profit from that. So instead, what they're doing is they're taking the time to actually train and develop the skills to do this kind of building and development with tribal residents on the reservation, and now they're creating an employee-owned enterprise, an employee-owned construction company that will actually build the community for them, and they will also therefore build what will they then need? They'll then need property management, so they're going to develop those skills with their residents and create an enterprise to manage the property as well, wastewater management, things of that nature, and it goes on and on and on. So they are realizing their potential to be an economic driver in their community, and how can they intentionally drive that economic activity to be connected to the residents and the needs of the community and build up the capacity to address that. So this is a really inspiring story. I would check them out and learn more. And I think next slide, and I'm done. And so those are just a few examples of our work. We study this kind of work in communities across the country, and we write about it extensively, and we have tons and tons of resources that are available for free on our website. So please check it out. CommunityWealth.org is largely about the field and all kinds of organizations that are doing this work in the field, and then democracycollaborative.org has all of our reports, which are available open source. And I actually am finishing up a little early. I was so nervous about running over on my time that I think I just charged through. I don't know if there's space for dialogue or conversation. I can kind of barely see folks, but if there are any questions or comments, I have about 5 minutes. Anybody? I see in the back. So a lot of times with communities, we begin by doing an asset mapping activity, and that's really sort of getting as many of the main key stakeholder residents in the room as you can, doing intentional, engaged community planning sessions and engagement sessions to really determine what those assets are. And when we talk about assets, you really have to think about assets very broadly. Of course, institutions are one kind of asset, enterprise is another kind of asset, but human capital is an asset. There's a lot of informal economic activity that happens in communities that people don't recognize. I mean, for example, on the reservation, there is nothing that supplies the needs of the residents of that reservation. They have to drive an hour to go to a Walmart to get food. It's that sort of a thing. But yet there is a lot of activity that's happening on the reservation, between cousins and aunts and uncles and things. I need a quilt, and so someone's making a quilt over here, or has a garden over here that they're sharing with their neighbors. There's a lot of informal economic activity in almost all communities, and really understanding what that informal activity is and who's doing it is a really good place to start. Particularly in rural areas, when you might not necessarily have a large institution, we talk about supply chains. So people are purchasing things, people need things. Where are those things coming from, and what is the supply chain? You know, a tractor, for example, is not just a tractor. There are all these parts and pieces that go into creating and building and fixing and maintaining a tractor. What are all the intersection points along a supply chain that you can think of? So really thinking of assets and needs as an asset really broadly. So, another question. We focus on nonprofit and publicly owned enterprises because they have a mission to serve a community. They are not owned by investors that don't necessarily have a mission to a community, that don't actually have a commitment to a community. So it's a leverage point. That isn't to say that you can't work with private institutions, and in fact we've done some work with Drexel in Philadelphia, which is a private institution. We tend to focus on a public or a nonprofit because they generally have a mission-serving focus, and that's a good leverage point. If you're trying to talk to an institution, you have a mission to serve, and oftentimes, especially for public institutions, the mission to serve is community. So how are you defining community? So it's an access and leverage point, but that isn't to say that you can't also work with private institutions, but that's our focus. Yep, Ian.
Came down a little bit early to Roanoke. Can you give us a little peek at what you came to do, who you might have met with?
Yeah, sure.
Might see you again.
Well, I can't answer the second question, when you might see me again, but I did come down here on an invitation from Scott Tate, who's sitting in the back there. I also can't really see him. There he is, who works with Virginia Tech, and we met at a previous conference. And he's managed to convene a group of stakeholders in the community who are interested in this kind of interconnected economic development work. And so I spoke this morning with some representatives from the hospital system. It's Carillion. I cannot say it. I don't know what my problem is. Carillion. I said it wrong like 5 times, so I just decided I'd say hospital and be vague. Local nonprofit, someone from the city government, to really talk and think about how a lot of the work that's already been done in Roanoke could maybe connect a little better and move forward together. And I will say that a lot of the work that we do as outside experts is really creating a space that can bring people together in a community that they're already doing the work. You know, as Ethan mentioned earlier, the expertise exists here. It's already here, so it's a matter of lifting it up, connecting it, and putting the resources behind it that are needed to. And by resources, I mean money, and I mean time and energy. That's what this needs. But I have maybe one more question, and then I'm going to make room for Daniel, who I'm excited to hear talk. All right? Oh, one more.
What are some of the persistent frustrations or barriers to doing the work that you do?
There are a lot. Collaboration is a very difficult thing, especially when we live in a society where competition is sort of the predominant norm. So there is a cultural shift that really needs to occur for how business is done. So really shifting from a competitive mindset, and I mean that not just in sort of the capitalistic business-minded sense of a competition, but also, I mean, nonprofit organizations are generally territorial. They are competing for funds. They are competing for talent. There are a lot of challenges behind getting institutions. The Cleveland Clinic and university hospitals hate each other in Cleveland. They hate each other. They are competitors, and it took a lot to get them to the table. And the only thing that really got them to the table was a large, esteemed institution, the Cleveland Foundation, sort of forcing them to come to the table, really having the clout to do that. So I would say collaboration and capital. Access to capital is a continual frustration, and we're also always very grateful to the support of funders, but funders are an equal partner in this and need to be willing to take risks, accept mistakes that communities make and let them make mistakes, and be patient and invested over the long haul. So that would be the other thing I would call out. Thank you very much for your time.